Whoever wins it is literally going to be able to implement and run the financial architecture and the economic architecture of the world for the next 50 to 100 years. History does not care about principles. Power vacuums always get filled. We're back to a time of hard power and defense. This is the Game of Thrones that we've been talking about. It is literally like chess at a civilizational scale. Now, to the people at the top, this is a game. This is the way the world works, is not the same as endorsing. The world that we know is over, and it's heading into something that we don't know exactly what it is, but it's not going to be boring. The world we grew up in is gone, and it ain't coming back. Now in an age where macro and geopolitical conflicts and geopolitical issues are dominating markets. You don't have to love the way the world is to profit from it. You just have to see it clearly. Hi, everyone. Happy Sunday. Hope you are all doing great. As you can see, I don't have my usual setup this week. I'm up in New York City for a number of meetings, and you can see I've got my sidekick Gus over here. So if you see him running around in the background, just enjoy the show, I guess. In any case, had a number of meetings, equal parts fascinating and in some ways equal parts terrifying. So what I thought we would do today is a little bit different, just run through a bunch of the thoughts that I have been thinking about and debating with myself and talking about with others. And essentially what it really all comes down to is a continuation of a lot of the things we have spoken about before. And that is that behind the scenes, there's this grand power competition between the United States and China. And we wrote this about a year ago as part of our research, the silent war and the race to control the future. And it's essentially a technology race. And whoever wins it is literally going to be able to implement and run the financial architecture and the economic architecture of the world for the next 50 to 100 years. So this is not exactly a minor thing here. Let me see. And this is what brings us back to Iran. And obviously Iran is, dominating all the conversations recently. And, is there a plan? Is there not a plan? What the hell are we doing? Why are we there? Here we are again, another foreign war. And listen, I get all of it. Totally understand. But we do have to talk about it because we're now in an age where macro and geopolitical conflicts and geopolitical issues are dominating markets. So the idea that we can, just ignore what these, psychopaths at the top have in mind for us, I just don't think that is reality. But as it gets to Iran, I've had a number of conversations over the last couple of weeks, obviously a number of Twitter debates with people. And the bottom line is, I can't say it any more clearly that there is a plan. And I know there's a lot of people who think there isn't a plan. But what I would just say, just because you don't agree with the plan doesn't mean that there isn't one. Just because you don't like it doesn't mean that there isn't one in one. And just because this isn't going perfectly doesn't mean there isn't one. Now, I've never made any claim that this is going perfectly. I don't know for sure how it's going. But I think it's way too early to say, who has won and who has lost. These things typically go on for much longer than people anticipate. And I think because it was so quick and swift in Venezuela, a lot of people just naturally assumed that that's what the U.S. assumed would happen everywhere else in the world. And listen, that's just not the case. And, unfortunately, there will be boots on the ground in Iraq. I don't like it, but that's what's happening. Would I have voted for it? No. Would I have given the order myself? No. Do I support it? Not really. But do I understand what's happening? Yeah, I understand what's happened. I understand why it's happening. And I understand why it's happening now. And it really does come down to this great power competition between the U.S. and China, because, we have this prisoners swap going on right now where they need certain things from the United States. They need technology and they need energy, and we need pharmaceuticals and we need rare earths. And so we're sending them back and forth. Each side's sending them back and forth. And behind the scenes, each side is dramatically trying to become independent of the other one. And that's where it's at right now. And the one of the tools that the United States can use against China is energy, and that's why we're in Iran. But there's something that's what we can't control it. All we can do is figure out how do we react to it and how does it impact our portfolios. But there's a great quote from Winston Churchill, and it says, "The statesman who yields to war fever must realize that once that signal is given, he is no longer the master of policy, but the slave of unforeseeable and uncontrollable events." And this is what I would say as it relates to Iran. we don't know how it's going to go. And there's a number of different permutations of how it can branch off. And the idea that you and I know this, and people on Twitter know this, and people on YouTube and people writing blog posts know this, but the US military doesn't know this. It's just silly. They're literally trained that no plan survives first contact. There's a number of different permutations that can happen. And that's what's going on now. We're going through the different permutations. And again, I don't know if this is going to end next week or next year. I wish it had never started, but it did. And now we have to kind of figure out where it goes from here. But I think it's way too early to say what the definitive conclusion is. And this has kind of led to, what's the right way to say it? I don't know if I want to call it just, probably just sadness is probably the way to say it. Because we've kind of been expecting something like this to happen for a long time. We've written a lot about it. We've talked a lot about it. We've said this is a Game of Thrones, and Game of Thrones is not necessarily a nice show, right? But something happened a couple of weeks ago, and I was texting and back and forth with a couple of friends, and we were talking about how ridiculous it was. And my friend said, "Yeah, I know, it's utterly ridiculous. That's what I imagined happened, though." And I kind of responded and said, "The day that I long feared would arrive finally has." And you know, you try to keep above it all, but it's literally heartbreaking, right? And I basically said the worry. The basically I said, I worry for the world that my son is going to inherit, and at this point, my only prayer is to keep him safe. And I'm sure there's a lot of parents out there that feel the same way, and I'm sure there's a lot of parents of soldiers who feel like this even more than we do. But that's the truth of where it is now. So trying to see through the fog of all of this, I think, is probably more important than everyone. And that's kind of what my friend responded and said. That's the truth for everyone now. Let me keep going here. So what I did here today is I put down a bunch of stuff, basically conviction versus confliction. And what I mean by that is, based on the framework that I use, and we've talked about this, statecraft, and Michael Every is a friend of mine, and we've talked about that a lot. And the reality is we kind of have this battle between conviction and confliction. What we mean by that is, we feel like we have a pretty good understanding of what's going on, probably see what's happening and why it's happening and where it's going, probably better than any point in our career. But we're conflicted. At least I'm conflicted, right? I don't like that it's happening. I don't wish that it continues, but I think it's going to. And, whether it's on a personal level or a professional level, I have all these conflicts that keep running into each other. And so I just call it the split. And we'll walk through some of the different ways that it is, but it all, it's funny because it's also related to everything that I love to think about. I love geopolitics. I love thinking about markets, but the world that we know is over, and it's heading into something that we don't know exactly what it is, but it's not going to be boring. But it's not just across markets either. It's across so many different things. It's about politics, whether the divide is Democrat versus Republican, whether it's economic, where it's decoupling and reshoring and going to two supply chains rather than one supply chain. It's cultural. You get a value divergence between the old and the young, and it's celebrating, or it's accelerating. Not only that, but it's also between nations, right? Part of it has to do with immigration issues. Part of it has to do with economic issues relate inside those different cultures and how those different cultures, conduct business. Geopolitical is obviously one where there's great fits, where spheres of influence are replacing, the international order. We've talked extensively and written extensively about the world's rules-based order coming down. And, in commodities, we're going back into a world where real things matter more than they have in the past. And as that changes, though, this law of one price, we can literally see it in real time going away. And what that means is, over the last 40, 50 years, if a commodity traded at one price in the US, it traded at the same price in Africa and at the same price in Asia. With small differences, but for the most part. But now with dual supply chains, fracturing relations, going towards tariffs and national security, we're going to have different prices for the same type of energy in different parts of the world. And that has immense effects for literally everything. And this is what I was saying earlier. Listen, there is a plan. You might not like it. I might not like it, but there is a plan. And this is another part where they're split. You can oppose U.S. foreign policy, and you can recognize that the Iranian regime is a genuine threat. Those are not mutually exclusive. And whatever you think about the United States, whether you think they are the bringer of justice or whether you think they are the terrorists themselves, that's up to you. But even if you think that they are the bad guys in this story, it's really, really hard to cede the moral high ground to the Iranian regime. And I would, I would very much encourage you not to do that. Then there's there's an analytical split, right? You know, Again, just because America has committed all these sins, that doesn't necessarily mean that Iran is going to emerge as the winner, and it doesn't make them saints. I was put something on Twitter yesterday that a lot of people will say that the U.S. is run by an elite who makes decisions based for them, without the populace, being concerned, or without any concern for the populace. Well, the same thing is going on in Iran. I mean, that is a minority regime who dictates to the majority. And if you think that the regime is fighting for freedom and justice of the Iranian citizens, you're just out of your mind. I mean, they're fighting for themselves, and that's what they've always done. And then, again, going back to the strategic play, there is a plan. You may not like it. Maybe it fails. We'll have to wait and see. But denying its existence is itself an analytical error. And that can have consequences for your portfolio. So again, I think with all of this, the most important thing is to be able to think clearly. Don't let the fog of the war, don't let the emotions of the war clog your thinking. You have to be as logical as you possibly can. And then this is another thing that I'm conflicted about. I mean, the reality is I kind of consider myself a libertarian at heart. I believe in individual freedom. I believe in small government. And I believe that each person is endowed with their own inalienable rights, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm also a student of realpolitik. I've studied this forever, and I've thought about this forever. And power is real, and self-interest drives nations. And nations have no permanent friends; they just have permanent interests. And history does not care about principles. I wish they did, and I'm sure you wish they did too. But at the end of the day, power is what history is all about. And the thing is, these are not really not necessarily contradictions. They're conflicts. There's tension. But I think if you're going to be objective about what's going on, you have to learn to live inside of this tension, and not have it affect the way you think and act. You need to, again, I know I keep repeating myself, but it's for me as much as it is for you. It's very easy to get caught up in the emotion of all this. And so that's essentially what this presentation today is about, is that tension and what it reveals, what it costs, why it matters, how I think about it, and why I think it's important that you guys think about it as well. So, for those who aren't kind of really familiar with the whole libertarian thing, it's essentially, individuals are the fundamental unit of moral concern. It's not states. It's basically the protection of the individual against the masses. All right. And it thinks about voluntary exchange and cooperation, leads to better outcomes than, coercion or being forced to do something. It also holds that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and concentrated power becomes very dangerous. And that's why literally we have institutions in the United States, and really part of the whole world. That's part of what the rules-based order was, as institutions that were put in place in order to design to limit power. And, it also holds that war is almost always a failure. So even when it's a success, it's still a failure because of all the pain that it caused. And diplomacy of markets and moral imagination is, that kind of goes by the wayside when you start using physical violence as a means to an end. But the goal in the libertarian world is to live where people are free, trade is free, and everybody's able to flourish without coercion, without domination by others. It's a nice dream, right? But the realpolitik of it, which it's very hard to ignore, is that states act in their own self-interest. Moral language is often covered for strategic maneuvering. Governments have a monopoly on violence. So it's hard to, and that's just a fact. You don't have to like it. And it's nice to try to build a world that doesn't have that. But as of now, that is the truth. And power vacuums always get filled. If one power source gets removed, somebody else rides in and takes their place. And even though you think that they shouldn't, they do. And geography, resources, and demographics, they shape outcomes, and they shape the way the world is more than ideology and good intentions. And this great game competition between major powers, it has never truly ended. Yeah, it goes into hibernation once in a while, and we have periods of relative peace. But at the end of the day, everybody is always trying to grab more power. And understanding that this is the way the world works is not the same as endorsing it. And I want to make that clear. You can understand how the world works and not necessarily think that it should work that way. Now, I also think that while at heart I'm probably an idealist, idealist. I also consider myself a realist, and to have idealism without realism, I think, is very naive. But if you have realism without idealism, you're also a nihilist. So you don't want to go that far either. The goal really is not to pick one. It's to use each as a check on the other. Realpolitik tells you what is. And I think libertarian values, to a certain extent, remind you what matters. And I think the most honest and objective analysts for geopolitics and military actions are those who can both feel the intellectual thrill of it and the moral weight of it. And, what I've said is to analyze the world clearly is to see both its terrible logic and its terrible cost, and to refuse to look away from either. And again, so this is where I'm at. This is the conviction versus the confliction. It's not an easy place to be. It's fascinating, but it's also terrifying. And that's kind of what this is like. Why is it fascinating? Well, history rhymes in visible, almost eerie ways. You can see the same stories playing out over and over and over again. Only the names change, right? There's that saying, there's nothing new under the sun. And the strategic logic, in some cases is elegant. If you kind of understand what the plan is and what the United States is trying to pull off, it is literally like chess at a civilizational scale. Now, I know that people are saying there is no 3D chess. And here's the thing. You're right. This is not 3D chess. They had literally said what they were going to do. And it was in the national security document. Trump has talked about this for 30 or 40 years. People get so upset about these 3D chess and 4D chess moves, but they're also willing to say that Iran can do these 3D chess and 4D chess moves, but the United States can't. And again, I don't think this is chess at all. This is just power politics. If you step back and look at the big board, it's pretty obvious what's going on. And then, of course, each side believes that they have the moral superiority. Each side believes that they are the hero. And watching all of this unfold in real time, it's absolutely fascinating. But it's also tragic, right? Because it's real people that pay the price for this, right? It's people's lives, not just those whose lives are impacted, but those whose lives are taken away. And, wars often happen that could have been avoided. And, but once they start, it's almost impossible to stop them. And ordinary lives get disrupted. And, people on the other side of the world that you've never even met end up getting affected by the decisions that are made here. And that's, going back to be a libertarian, I believe in the rights of the individual. And the other thing is, like, when we refer to this as a game, it kind of obscures the human cost of all this. But listen, it is a game. To the people at the top, this is a game. And again, you don't have to like this, but recognizing that that's what it is, and they're trying to win the game, I think that will help you understand what's going on. So as it starts to come to markets, my libertarian leanings kind of tell me one thing. My realpolitik training tells me another. But at the end of the day, only one of them can show up in the portfolio, or at least one of them ends up dominating the portfolio. And I think the other thing is, I don't know if anybody else has these same issues or thinks about these same things or has these same conflicts as I do. But if you do, what I would say is I think it's okay to be conflicted. It's human. It shows that you do still have some humanity. But managing a portfolio demands you separate the way you want the world to be from the way the world actually is. Now, this is especially true for someone like me who manages money for other people. I don't have the same political ideals that my clients do. I don't have the same outlook on the world as my clients do. I don't have the same belief system that a number of my clients do. But I have a fiduciary duty to manage their portfolio and to try and protect it, and to try and grow it. If I start placing my own personal idealist or personal preferences into their portfolio, I have immediately or potentially immediately shirked my fiduciary responsibility. So it becomes an even tougher thing. So again, thinking clearly and not putting idealistic ideas into a portfolio, especially when you're managing it for somebody else, is extremely important. Now, if you're managing your own money, that's a different story. You're welcome to do whatever you want. But you know, I think there's two different ways to look at this. There's these two different worlds, but only one of them I think is going to pay off. There's the world we want and the world that is. And in the world we want free trade and open borders, right? We want diplomacy. We want countries to treat each other nicely. We want green energy transition where the planet isn't damaged at all. And we want multilateral institutions that respect each other and limit each other's power and keeps the peace. And then we also want mean reversion in political extremism. We don't want to swing back and forth from one extreme to the other. But in the real world, that's not what we get, unfortunately. In the real world, we get borders, we get blocks, we get walls, we get friendshoring, we get political disruption. And deterrence is the only currency that really works. Energy security trumps energy ideology. And I can tell you, I know there's a lot of people out there say, we absolutely need to transition to energy, to ideology and go green. That's fine. And that would be fantastic. But I also know many of those same people, if they had to choose between being able to push a button and the lights come on and being able to push a button and the lights don't come on, they would choose the one where the lights come on, even if it hurts the environment. And they may say that they don't, but if it really came down to it and they needed to push that button in order to save their kid or save someone in their family, they would push that button. And then, in the world we have now, extremism is accelerating. It's not reverting to the mean. So we have to all of this to deal with. And the other thing, this is all kind of related. I know I'm repeating myself a little bit, but I think it's important to really hammer it home. Trying to change the world is much different goal than trying to change the size of your portfolio. They're not the same. They could be the same, but they're often not. And it may actually require doing the exact opposite of each other. So you kind of have to decide what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Are you trying to change the world? And if you do, it's a very worthy goal. You got my respect. But that's you need to be honest with yourself of whether you're trying to change the world or whether you're trying to change the size of your portfolio, right? And you need to when you're implementing allocations into your portfolio, you need to be honest with yourself of which one you're doing. Because the hardest trade you'll ever have to make is the one that offends the way you want the world to be, right? I hate government intervention as an example. Well, industrial policy is the dominant economic force of the 2000s, and that is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So yeah, it's great that you don't like government intervention, but that is going to affect your portfolio more than anything else in the years ahead. And I oppose military spending. Okay, great. Well, NATO rearmament. All across Europe, it's actually the whole world. The whole world is going to spend more on military and defense spending. And so, you are going to be fighting against one of the biggest trends that you have ever seen in your life. Let's see, I believe in free markets. Well, so do I. Everybody, we would love to have free markets, but state capitalism and national interest is now dominating free markets. You can see this all over the world. And so again, you're going to be fighting the biggest trend that you've probably ever seen. Let me just keep going through here. So what does this mean for how you allocate? Well, number one, geography is back. Geography matters. We've said this before, but for the last 50 years, the most important thing was not where something was made or where it was produced. The most important thing was who could produce it the fastest, the cheapest, and get it to market the quickest. That was the primary concern, but that is gone. Now national interest and national security and self-sufficiency and being robust, those are more important buzzwords than price and efficiency. And we're back to a time of hard power and defense. This is the Game of Thrones that we've been talking about. The realignment is structural. This is not going to go on for 2 or 3 years and be done. This is going to go on for 2 or 3 decades, if not more. And again, this is real. This is the real politic of it. This is what's going to happen, right? And all around the world is going to do this, and that is going to be one of the biggest impacts on your portfolio. Energy security premium. We start to get back to the law of one price. Energy is what this is all about, and geopolitically stable supply inputs are going to make or they're pardon the pun, they're going to trump all other decisions because energy is the most important thing, and the countries and the regions that can produce it themselves are going to have a leg up on those who don't. And then finally, like, tail risk has changed because for a long time, basically my whole career, everything would always revert back to the mean. What I mean, you would have a couple of months, couple of weeks, couple of months, maybe even a year of volatility, but then it would revert back to the mean because we lived in the age of the rules-based order, and the rules-based order kind of kept everything in control. But that's being torn down. So where before we would have a short-term recession and, governments would come in and do QE or whatever it was and get things back on track, I'm not sure that those are going to work anymore. The new tail risks are the supply chains, are walls going up. It's national government interest trumping your individual or your corporate interest. And so, I think the tail risks have changed dramatically. This is, we've talked a lot about, gold being a key part of a portfolio, but this is why I also think you need to start thinking about gold, maybe not just a bigger bullion position in your portfolio, but different ways of using gold. Because if gold is coming back, not even if it doesn't come back as an official currency, if we're moving into this period where hard power and hard commodities and hard assets, play a bigger role, I think there's a way for it to play a bigger role in your portfolio. And it doesn't just have to be miners, and it doesn't just have to be bullion. I think monetary metals is a great way to bridge the gap and have an allocation to gold that sits within those two extremes within the gold world. So I would encourage you guys, if you haven't done it already, you guys know I'm on the advisory board. Go check them out. If you go to monetary-metals.com/Santiago, it talks about how you can put your gold to work productively. You can get paid a yield on it, and you don't have to just sit there and without any yield on it. You can actually get a return. And anybody who knows, if you can compound a return year after year after year, it doesn't take too long before it starts to really pay off. So again, go to monetary-metals.com/Santiago. But going back to the tail risk, we just wrote a paper on this. And so, the end of peacetime portfolios, we kind of grew up in the age of, Pax Americana, and everything, again, kind of reverted to the mean, where we would have short periods of volatility, but everything would come back to where it was. But I don't think that's the case anymore. And you really need to think about, how do you protect against a portfolio in times of great disruption that lasts for years, if not decades, as opposed to just a few weeks or a few months. So if that's of interest to you, check that out on our website. You can go to research.santiagocapital.com. But just as an example, one of the things we talked about there is, kind of the second and third order effects, right? So as an example, let's look at some of the potential risks out there. Is, the trade war escalation, right? That means supply chain reshoring, cost spikes, corporate margin compression, et cetera. That's the initial reaction. But the third order effects are EM export economies collapse, sovereign debt crises rise, dollar shortages in frontier markets, political instability. So again, you can see how, these things can kind of pyramid on top of each other to kind of get out of control, or the weaponization of the dollar, right? This is what I've often said, is that de-dollarization happens when it's forced, not when it's done by choice. And if the U.S. continues to weaponize the dollar and withhold the supply, that will accelerate the de-dollarization, but that's what causes the dollar to go higher, right? And central banks start to allocate their reserves in a more diversified fashion, and bilateral trade in non-dollar currencies start to pick up. So that's kind of the initial effect. But if that then leads to structural erosion of U.S. Treasury demand and long interest rates rise, then that can cause um, a sovereign debt crisis. But that sovereign debt crisis doesn't just hit the United States, it hits the whole world. And it's that sovereign debt crisis that then could usher in a global monetary regime. But in that period of time, in that great volatility, we think the dollar rises. Or, it could be something like war in Tehran. We've already got it in Iran, or it could be next one could be in Taiwan, right? And I think we all know that the reason that Taiwan is so important is because that's where global semiconductor supply comes from. But if that was to have a shock and those chips were not to ship the way they typically have, and we have some kind of a capex freeze or a digital infrastructure disruption, I mean, that changes everything. And then AI and automation rollout collapses, and all the money that's been borrowed to build out all these, AI companies, all of a sudden collapses, and that then pyramids or dominoes into a lot of other areas that end up affecting your portfolio. So these are the types of things that we're trying to figure out how to protect against, the things that are not and that don't necessarily just mean revert over a couple of weeks or a couple of months. So I think the most important with all of this stuff, if you're feeling these same conflicts that I am, don't let it paralyze you. Acknowledge the split. Write them down. Whatever you're struggling with, write them down. Think about them, but then put them aside and don't let those affect your analysis. In other words, don't try to deal with those at the same time you're allocating your portfolio. Think of those as separate things. The other thing is you got to analyze the world as it is. It's great to have the way you want the world to be, but you have to analyze the world as it is. And if you're going to allocate a portfolio accordingly, especially when it's your hard-earned money, you've worked forever and you toiled and you put up with all kinds of bullshit from your boss, et cetera, and you have this money, you don't just want to give it away, right? And so I think when you're doing your analysis, you got who has the power, who really has the power, not who you want to have it, who actually has it, and who's accumulating more power. What are they going to do with that power? Just like with individuals, looking at what are their incentives. Follow their incentives, not what they say. Follow what they do, not what they say. And then finally, don't only analyze the world as is, but invest in the world as is. And so I think if you can kind of do those, your portfolio is going to be better off. Unfortunately, and I hate saying this, but the world we grew up in is gone, and it ain't coming back. And I hate saying it, but that's the reality of where we're at now. And the question is not whether to mourn it. The question is whether to be positioned for what comes next. I always say, when I'm on social media, when I'm doing these podcasts, when I'm doing this show, this is how this is when I'm talking about investments, I'm talking about the way the world is, not the way I want the world to be. I'm not an idealist when it comes to allocating a portfolio, and I don't think you should be either. And finally, I'd say you don't have to love the way the world is to profit from it. You just have to see it clearly. And being a clear-eyed investor is not the same thing as being heartless. You don't have to give up your humanity. You don't have to stop being a good person. And finally, I would say, allocating a portfolio clearly and making money is the precondition to have the resources to make any difference in the world at all. So that's it for that part of the whole spiel. Let me just run through a couple of charts here. The other thing that's kind of a contradiction right now is markets have broken down severely, but they're really only down about 10%. So the fact that they've broken down hard, but they haven't collapsed yet, it makes it really difficult because they could go down a lot more, but they're also getting into the very oversold territory. And so as we look here right now, we've got the RSI almost below 30. That's an area where we would start thinking about, would we want to be buying? Look at the stochastics; they're down in single digits. That's typically an area where we would start to want to be buying. Same thing with the S&P 500, single digit, stochastics, RSI falling, but now we're below all the moving averages on the equities as well. Same thing with the NASDAQ. Russell 2000, same thing. It's actually held up better than the larger markets, which is kind of surprising to me. But if it takes out that 200-day, which it's sitting right out, then we could see a lot more downside here. Nvidia, it's kind of the same thing. It's broken all support. Microsoft this is exactly what's see. You see the first peak last fall around September. When it started to pull back, I thought it was going to do exactly what it has done, over the last 3 months, or the last 4 months. Unfortunately, it pulled back, it ran up again and made a second peak at about 540, and then it's collapsed. So what's happened this part of the year is exactly what I was going to happen in Q4 of last year. So, as most things in life, timing is everything. You're also starting to see credit default swaps are starting to rise pretty significantly. It's not yet gotten to where it was last April, but it's starting to get close. But the real story is both Brent crude and WTI crude. And what I think we're going to see is we're going to continue to see the divergence here. With boots going on the ground in the Middle East, I think you're going to see you're going to see Brent. Right now, Brent's about $10 higher. $15 higher than WTI. I think you're going to see that spread blow out even more. Natural gas, this is, the United States is the biggest producer of natural gas, and, the price here has hardly moved. Wouldn't surprise me if we see that go higher. Gold has kind of gone sideways for the last week. It broke, but look at its stochastics, right? Or its stochastics are low single digits, so it's been beaten up pretty bad. Same for silver. Silver is not yet down to its 200-day moving average. I think it's still going to go down to at least its 200-day moving average before it makes a meaningful move higher. Dollar index back above 100 through all levels of support, and there's not a whole lot of resistance, right now. So, with all that's going on, it wouldn't surprise me at all to see the dollar continue to go higher, especially if we continue to get geopolitical unrest. The put call ratio is a little bit elevated, but not dramatic. So that's the one thing I would say is people are, they're not rushing out to buy all. The problem is trying to buy puts now is really hard because the VIX is in the high 20s, low 30s. Most equities have sold off pretty hard already. It's hard to get really excited about buying a lot of puts right now. It's not to say that things can't get lower, but you're paying a lot more for insurance now than you were a couple months ago. And then, this is the daily sentiment index. We're getting very low on the S&P and the NASDAQ. Volatility's in the high 70s, S&P and the NASDAQ are in the low teens. If we get 1 or 2 more days of downside, you're going to be in single digits. And that's kind of where I have a rule where I always start adding a little bit of exposure if we get down those levels. So that's it for this week. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys are staying safe. Be back again next week. But in the meantime, if you want to read more about some of the stuff we talked about today, if you go to research.santiagocapital.com, 2 different options to subscribe, and we'd love to have you over there. Okay, guys, that's it. Thanks. Hi, I'm Brent Johnson with Santiago Capital. 4 months ago, we published Empire by Code and made a controversial claim. The US dollar stablecoins aren't just financial innovation. They're weapons of monetary power capable of extending the American hegemony without firing a single shot. The response was pretty intense. Some thought it was thought-provoking, others thought it was too conspiratorial, some thought it was ridiculous. But we continue to stand by the call. And since then, we have continued watching and we have continued researching. Because the empire isn't debating whether or not to expand. It's already expanding, right now, in real time. In Empire by Code, we also showed you why stablecoins matter, how 200 billion in tokenized dollars are already bypassing banks, eroding sovereignty, and making dollar access virtually unstoppable. We made the case that this is America's next great power move and tool to use on the global stage. But we left one question unanswered. Who controls it? Because while the United States will wield stablecoins as a strategic weapon, the battles to determine who gets to wield that weapon and which factions get to deploy it and under what rules are playing out right now. And the battles are brutal. In short, welcome to the stablecoin wars.
These are actual conflicts with trillion-dollar stakes being fought on multiple fronts. Private issuers versus banks, regulators in civil war over jurisdiction, big tech plotting a return, nations resisting dollarization while their citizens have already voted with their wallets. The weapon exists, and the empire will use it. But the fight over the factions of who controls it is vicious, and most people have no idea it's even happening at all. So I'll give you a quick look into what's going on. Issuers generate billions in profit, while traditional financial institutions are scrambling to launch competing coins before they become irrelevant. The SEC, CFTC, and Federal Reserve are fighting over jurisdiction, which creates chaos, which will ultimately determine which institutions get blessed and which ones get banned. In the yield battle, issuers earn billions of investing reserves while paying nothing to customers. Who deserves that yield will determine who captures trillions in economic rents. And in the blockchain wars, Ethereum currently dominates stablecoin infrastructure, but Solana and Tron are fighting for the prize, which is to become essentially the settlement layer for the entire digital economy. And in emerging markets, countries like Venezuela, Argentina, Turkey, and Nigeria, citizens are abandoning their local currencies for US dollar stablecoins. Now, some countries will be able to manage this better than others, but others will collapse completely. And we also have stablecoins versus CBDCs. Central banks are building digital currencies to fight back, but markets have already chosen and have definitively chosen dollar stablecoins. Each of these battles shapes who holds power for the next century. This is much bigger than just stablecoins, and it's much bigger than just crypto. This is a battle for control of the base layer of global commerce. And when currency becomes software, whoever controls that infrastructure controls everything. Every transaction, every contract, every financial relationship. The winner writes the rules for how value moves for the next few generations. That's why the banks that ignored crypto are now scrambling. It's why China banned stablecoins while building the digital yuan. It's why these fights are so vicious. Because losing means irrelevance, while winning means power that exceeds Bretton Woods, the Eurodollar system, and the SWIFT network combined. But this time, it's encoded in software and distributed immediately on a global basis. As we said above, the stablecoin wars have already begun. The empire is expanding, but who controls it and holds the reins is still being decided in real time. We've mapped the battlefield, identified the players, analyzed what's at stake. The full paper we're putting out is called Stablecoin Wars, one battle after another. Be sure to read it, because the infrastructure being built today determines who holds power tomorrow. The question is whether or not people will understand what has happened before it's too late. And these battles will very much determine much of your financial future. Thanks for listening.